Welcome to the session on features of dialectical method. The dialectical method. Dialectic is the method of progression among concepts whereby a more true or adequate concept is generated from inadequate beginnings through overcoming the oppositions intrinsic to them. Origins. The term dialectic is used by Plato to describe the method of Socrates, who used to seek philosophical truth through disputation. In ancient Greece, dialectic was a kind of disputation undertaken as a game or exercise in which questions were asked and answers for the most part had to be yes or no. This is for Plato a method preeminently suited to finding truth, no matter whether the dialogue is carried on with another person or in one's own mind. Aristotle deals with dialectics in his topics books 7 and 8 and contrasts it with the inferior methods of disputation used by sophists. But Aristotle also thinks that dialectic, which teaches how to argue for or against a certain opinion, is inferior to logic, which teaches how to establish proofs. Later in the modern period, Kant gives a far more comprehensive meaning to the term, and it is this meaning which Hegel adopts, and by making use of it in a manner wholly antipathetic to Kantian philosophy, develops it into the cornerstone of his philosophical system. We will focus on these two important expositions of the method. Kantian dialectic. In the second part of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant diagnoses the failure of pure reason, trying to show that the attempt to employ concepts outside the limits prescribed by their empirical application leads inevitably to fallacies in the form of paradoxes, incoherencies and direct contradictions. This inevitable tendency of reason to transcend the limits of intelligibility Kant calls the dialectic of reason. Kant tries to show that all the traditional metaphysical arguments, specifically rationalist ones, arguments about the substantiality and immortality of the soul, the infinitude of the universe, the necessary existence of God and the reality of free will are inevitably grounded in contradiction and paradoxes. The principal and most compelling instance of such reasoning is that as to the existence of God, and it is to the refutation of the traditional arguments for God's existence that Kant turns his attention in much of the dialectic. In particular, he presents a famous refutation of the ontological argument, a refutation which a great many have chosen to regard as conclusive and also as damaging to the whole enterprise of rational theology. According to the ontological argument, the idea of God being conceived as the idea of a perfect being, his existence should be contained among his necessary attributes. For to conceive of perfection and yet to conceive of it as non-existent is to conceive an impossible contradiction in terms. A non-existent perfection would not be perfect, hence God must exist. Kant's refutation of this consists of an argument that turns on the premise that existence is not a predicate. No concept can imply its own instantiation, and the logical character of existence is misrepresented by any attempt to make it part of the concept of a thing. It is therefore impossible, Kant argues, to advance from the concept of God to the existence of God. Thus for him, the dialectic is the process of fallacious reasoning by which reason arrives at untenable knowledge claims concerning the self, the world as a whole and God. Hegelian dialectic. In the Kantian analysis, it is not entirely clear whether the limits of human understanding and the limits of truth are one and the same, or whether on the contrary, he is hinting at a world of things in themselves about which we can at least know that we do not know them. Because of this ambiguity, it has been possible for Hegel to interpret Kant's critique of pure reason as eventually upholding the same. The Kantian contradictions, Hegel thinks, are only contradictions from the limited point of view of the understanding. They therefore provide a kind of logical impetus to transcend that point of view into the world of pure reason itself. from the perspective of which these and many other contradictions could be resolved. Thus, while Kant uses the word dialectic to refer to the propensity to fall into contradictions, Hegel uses it to mean the propensity to transcend them. This process of transcendence is the true course of logic, and dialectic in the Hegelian system, as explicated in his work Science of Logic, is the name for the intellectual pursuit whose end point is not limited or partial, but on the contrary, absolute truth itself. Hegel puts it thus: a deeper insight into the antinomies, or rather into the dialectic nature of reason, shows us that every concept is a unity of opposite moments, which could therefore be asserted in the shape of an antinomy. Modern conceptions of logic have tended to the view that logic is an instrument whereby consequences of some premise are derived. Logic is powerless to give knowledge until the premise is determined. This is emphatically not Hegel's view. He thinks that the premise of logic is determined by logic itself. The premise of logic is pure indeterminate being, being conceived without any of the particular determinations through which it makes itself manifest to the understanding. For him, being is the single great a priori concept, from reflecting on the nature of which we arrive at an a priori theory of reality. Logic begins then from being and advances towards its conclusion, which is the absolute idea or truth itself. This absolute idea is thought and reality at once. It is like the God of Spinoza, who comprehends the whole of things and, being identical with that whole, exists thinking himself. Each concept in the dialectical process that leads to this supreme conception is obtained from that of being by a sequence of dialectical transformations. It should be noted that this conception of logic is inspired from a unique explication of Kantian system by Johann Gottlieb Fichte in his book Science of Knowledge. The task of any such philosophy as Kantian is to discover the absolutely unconditioned first principle of human knowledge, he says there. In that endeavor, logicians offer an instance of necessary and indisputable truth in the law of identity, that is, A is equal to A. But even in that law, something is presupposed that we have yet to justify, namely the existence of A. I can advance to the truth of A equal to A once A has been posited as an object of thought. But what justifies me in positing A? There is no answer. Only if we can find something that is posited in the act of thinking itself will we arrive at a self-justifying basis for our claims of knowledge. This thing that is posited absolutely is the I, for when the self is the object of thought, that which is posited is identical with that which posits. In the statement that I equal to I, we have therefore reached a bedrock. Here is a necessary truth that presupposes nothing. The self-positing of the self is the true ground of the law of identity and hence of logic itself. To this first principle of knowledge, which he calls the principle of identity, Fichte adds a second. The positing of the self is also a positing of the not self. For what I posit is always an object of knowledge, and an object is not a subject. That which comes before my intuition in the act of self-knowledge is intuited as not self. This is the principle of counterpositing or opposition, from which, in conjunction with the first principle, a third can be derived, namely that the not self is divisible in thought and opposed to a divisible self. This third principle, the grounding principle, is supposedly derived by a synthesis of the other two. It is the ground of transcendental philosophy, which explores the division of the self by concepts, whereby the world is constituted as an object of knowledge. Coming back to Hegel, what are these dialectical transformations referred to, and what is the structure of reason's dialectic? It should be borne in mind that the terms of Hegel's logic are not propositions or judgments, but rather concepts, and it is concepts in his view that are true or false. But falsehood for him is a form of limitation or incompleteness, whereas truth is a form of wholeness, a transcendence of all the limitations. Then dialectic is the method of progression among concepts, whereby a more true concept is generated from inadequate beginnings through overcoming the oppositions intrinsic to them. The dialectical process then is as follows. A concept is posited as a starting point. It is offered as a potential description of reality. It is found at once that from the standpoint of logic, this concept must bring its own negation with it. To the concept, its negative is added automatically, and a struggle ensues between the two. The struggle is resolved by an ascent to the higher plane from which it can be comprehended and reconciled. This ascent is the process of diremption, which generates a new concept out of the ruins of the last. This new concept generates its own negation, and so the process continues until, by successive application of the dialectic, the whole of reality has been laid bare. For instance, imagine a kind of impersonal dialectical thought or thinker attempting to understand the world. It has nothing available to it but thought, and so must put forward as its sole instrument of knowledge the concepts which enlighten it. Of necessity, it begins from the single most indeterminate concept, that which is contained in all concepts and yet which is logically precedent to them, the concept of being. But what is being? Considered as unmediated by reflection and as free from extraneous determinations? It is surely nothing. Hence, the concept of being contains within itself its own negation, that is nothing. And the dialectical opposition between these two concepts is resolved only in the passage to a new concept. This concept is becoming, which captures the truth contained in that previous opposition, the truth of the passage of being into nothing and nothing into being. To our impersonal thinker, the world now appears as becoming rather than as being, and this perception is truer than the preceding one, although as yet far short of that absolute truth in which all such oppositions will be resolved. Becoming seems to be a specifically temporal characteristic, but the temporal character of Hegel's logic is nothing more than a metaphor. From the point of view of logic, becoming suffers from the same defects as being. It generates its own contradiction out of the equipoise of arising and passing away. So, it gives way to a higher truth, which is that of determinate being, in which being and nothing are finally reconciled. Determinate being is that more familiar, less abstract form of existence, of which our world presents us with examples. Being becomes determinate by being limited, and so, as it were, incarnate in a certain identity. From this limitation, further oppositions arise, and the process continues until our thinker is brought by a seemingly ineluctable process to the absolute idea itself. So, perceiving the whole of reality as coming forth from what indispensable concept from which all thinking must begin. The dialectic of reason advances from pure immediate being through all the determinations of being which in sum constitute reality, so as to consummate itself in the absolute idea. As I have said, this absolute idea is the whole of reality, the truth of the world and God himself. Nothing exists in actuality that is not some determinant of pure being, and whose existence is not derived from the dialectical working out of that concept. Reason, because it generates everything, comprehends everything. Hence, in a famous phrase, the real is rational and the rational is real. Everything which exists of necessity, but it exists not in virtue of some eternal essence, but in virtue of the struggle of reason to constrain its successive concepts to give birth to their ever more detailed progeny. Hegel calls this struggle labor of the negative, and the world thus generated, being the product of reason, shows the cunning of reason. It reveals itself to reason, so that the apparently contingent can be seen to be really necessary, and the arbitrary and diffuse as directed and whole. A critique. Hegel's logic is in stark contrast with traditional theories, which see logical relations as timeless, determined not by content but by structure. A thought does not need time, one feels, in which to generate its consequences. Indeed, it is the essence of a logical consequence, that it is inseparable from the thought itself. A logical consequence can be neither lost nor acquired. Yet Hegel thinks of concepts as moving towards a greater grasp of reality, and he speaks of the working through of the dialectic as being necessary both to the truth and to the meaning of the result. He refers to the successive stages as moments which have to be overcome in the act of diremption, whereby a new concept is born. These temporal similes would be less puzzling if it were not also the case that Hegel thought of historical process in dialectical terms as the successive generation and overcoming of contradictions. And it is this aspect of Hegel put forward overtly in the lectures on the philosophy of history, but covertly elsewhere, that has been the most influential, perhaps because the most intelligible of his theories. It often seems that the whole of Hegelian metaphysics points towards a logical and historical interpretation at once. To some extent, this reflects a confusion on Hegel's part between logic conceived as a science of the relations among ideas and logic conceived as the intellectual operation whereby those relations are discovered. Let us summarize what has been said so far. Dialectic is the method of progression among concepts, whereby a more true or adequate concept is generated from inadequate beginnings through overcoming the oppositions intrinsic to them. In ancient Greece, dialectic was a kind of disputation undertaken as a game or exercise in which questions were asked and answers for the most part had to be yes or no. In the modern period, Kant gives a far more comprehensive meaning to the term, and it is this meaning which Hegel adopts, and by making use of it in a manner wholly antipathetic to Kantian philosophy, develops it into the cornerstone of his philosophical system. The inevitable tendency of reason to transcend the limits of intelligibility is what Kant calls dialectic of reason. For Hegel, the dialectic of reason advances from pure immediate being through all the determinations of being which in sum constitute reality, so as to consummate itself in the absolute idea which is the whole of reality, the truth of the world, and God himself. Now, some assignments for you. First, the real is rational and the rational is real. How far do you agree with this Hegelian dictum? Another, is not Hegel's system of logic outdated? If not, what is its contemporary relevance? One more, elucidate the influence that the dialectical movement in philosophy has had in the field of literary theory and social sciences. Some references now. The Cambridge Companion to Hegel, published in 1993 by Cambridge University Press. Hegel's Theory of a Modern State by Sholmo Avineri, published in 1972 by Cambridge University Press. And Hegel's Science of Logic, translated by W. H. Johnston and L. G. Struthers in 1929, published by Allen and Unwin, London. With that, we come to the end of this session. Thank you all for listening carefully, and all the best.